journalist. She received the H.L. Mencken Award for her reporting of the daycare hysteria in the Village Voice. She was really the first journalist to expose the daycare hysteria and the satanic panic as a hoax, and she wrote a wonderful book called Satan's Silence, which is pretty much the definitive history, social history of the daycare panic and the many wrongful convictions and false allegations of child sexual abuse that happened during the 80s and 90s. Most recently, she spoke last year about her new book, Sybil Exposed, the extraordinary true story of the famous multiple personality case, which was a book about how the original Sybil, which some of our senior citizens might remember from the 70s, was in fact fiction, not fact. And it's a really great book, and it came out last year, and I urge you all to read that as well. But in any case, today Debbie is going to be talking about a real live case, not a historical case, of 4 women who were released from prison just last week. And I'm very excited because when I scheduled Debbie to speak, she was going to kind of try to mobilize support and talk about how these 4 women were rotting away in prison, but suddenly, miraculously, through Debbie's work and the work of many other activists and advocates, they were released. As I said just last week, Debbie will probably be on Anderson Cooper tonight talking about this. At least you're on the schedule now, the last I checked. They postponed it, she was supposed to be on last week. But in any case, this is a very exciting case that just emerged, and I'm so happy to have you here to talk about this. Thank you, Debbie Nathan.
Thank you. Professor Horowitz said that this is a new case, and it's actually kind of a new case, but it's also an old case. This is a case that actually first emerged in the early 90s, so that's practically ancient history now, 1994, and it's just resolving now. The 4 women who you see here, these are their booking photos from the early 90s, and they just walked out of prison in Texas about 10 days ago. So in a way it's an old case, in a way it's a new case, and I'm going to talk about the oldness and the newness. And I'm also going to talk about another case because amazingly, days after they got out, another woman who was a daycare convict, she had been convicted of abusing kids in a daycare using these just ritualistic, horrific, unbelievable criminal acts. She was convicted with her husband in 1992, and she just walked out in Austin, Texas last week using the same legal strategies. We'll talk about those because they're something I want you to know about. Her husband will probably get out tomorrow. And these are, again, what I call fossil cases. They're old cases, part of a phenomenon that really isn't happening anymore, and that is the idea that people were getting together in the 80s and 90s to satanically abuse children. And this was a widespread belief among DAs, among police, among people in the Child Protection Service that were interviewing children, among psychotherapists, and it's not a belief anymore that's part of the criminal justice system. And we could talk about that. I could give you some citations. You can go on YouTube, for example, and look at a great movie about the first case. The movie's called Indictment, if you want to write that down. It has James Wood in it. And you can see what this phenomenon was about. But I didn't really come here just to talk about history, because even though, and I want to show you a movie in a minute about these women, but even though this is something that's not happening anymore and we're revisiting something from ancient times 20 years ago, there are still persistent problems regarding false accusations of child sex abuse and persistent problems regarding panic in our culture about danger to children. So I don't want you to think that even though we're going to come to a happy ending with these 2 cases I'm going to talk about, that there still isn't a big problem in this culture, and we'll also talk about that. So just to start off with, these are the booking pictures from the early 90s. I am an advocate in an organization called National Center for Reason and Justice, and we identify cases of false convictions, people who've been falsely convicted of hurting children, whether by sex abuse, by arson, by shaken baby syndrome, any scenarios that create panic and irrationality in the culture and in the criminal justice system. So we became aware of this case by accident in 2008. This guy up in the Yukon Territory, which is somewhere just south of Santa Claus, I guess, Happened to be doing some research on the web in 2006 and found something about this case and started driving from the Yukon Territory, where he had 24 mush dogs, and driving to San Antonio every year and researching this case. He became convinced they were innocent. He got a hold of us. We spent 5 years bringing this case to an Innocence Project in Texas and running it through the courts and the media. So let me show you a video. There's a filmmaker in Austin who's gotten a Sundance grant, and I'm going to show you the trailer of her story.
This is a case in which no crime at all occurred.
I'm dying. I'm dying because I cannot believe that this has actually gone on this far.
Tenderly, the trembling trees embrace the breeze.
This case is probably the last gasp of the satanic ritual abuse panic.
In reading the statement of what the accuser said happened, the whole scenario sounds like a porn movie, and it sounds like a man's version of what women do in their spare time.
She was just the one that I was just going to settle down with.
As you can see, the women were gay. There were 4 young women who were very nice teenagers, 18, 19, 20 years old. They'd all gone to high school together. They'd worked at a big grocery store, a kind of a Whole Foods type grocery store in San Antonio, and gotten to know each other if they didn't know each other previously. And this was the early 90s in San Antonio, and they're all Latinas. And their parents were shocked as they came out and basically kicked some of them out of the house. And so 4 girlfriends who were trying to just make it as older teenagers, working at Arby's, working at fast food places, and living in an apartment together. One of them, as you could see, some of them look kind of masculine and some of them look very feminine. So one of the real feminine ones, let's see, the one on the left, Liz. Liz had a very dysfunctional family. Her sister's partner, it was a guy who I have on investigation determined as a sociopath. Whenever he would get angry with someone, he had 2 children. He would accuse whoever he got angry with of sexually molesting his kids. I don't think that the authorities ever understood the extent to which he did this and what his past was doing this. But he got angry with Liz apparently because he put the moves on her and she wasn't interested, and he also didn't like lesbians. So he asked her if she could take care of his kids for a week, 2 little girls, ages 7 and 9, during the summer of 1994. And the little girls came over and spent a week, and according to these 4 defendants, just went to the Walmart and went to the park and bought goldfish at the drugstore, or the Walmart, and just went out and had Arby's and went swimming in the park. It was a typical week in the summer in San Antonio. Came back, were driven back to their home, seemed completely happy, kissed their aunt and all the other women, no problem. About 4 weeks later, their grandmother became very disturbed because they were taking the clothes off Barbie dolls. And she called up the father, and the father came home and was convinced that they were taking the clothes off Barbie dolls because they'd been sexually molested by the 4 lesbians. And he started pulling out tampons out of boxes and showing them the tampons and questioning them and so on and so forth. He had actually taken his kids to the police once before when they had taken the clothes off Barbies, and the police had not validated, or the child protection people had not validated that complaint. This time, when they found out that the 4 women who were allegedly involved with this were lesbians, they took the little girls to a pediatrician who worked for the county doing sexual assault exams on children. And when she heard about 4 lesbians, she put in the record this could be satanic related. She also examined the little girls' genitals and determined that one of them had some kind of a feature like a bump on her hymen, and the other one had a white line on her hymen, and she diagnosed these features as signs of abuse. And the case completely snowballed, and these are poor women. These families are poor. They had no money for a decent lawyer. They basically, the case just sort of sat for a few years, but then finally they were tried, and they were all convicted in 97 and 98. Their case raises a lot of really interesting issues, one of which is what this pediatrician did. Another one is how homophobia fueled some of these old cases, and I'll get into those in a minute. But before we do that, I just want to show you, can you toggle? Because I don't know how to toggle. Too much technology. I think that was the problem with these investigators. They were working with ideas and technologies they didn't understand. So we have some statistics here that I'll kind of bore you with just for a minute, because I know this has been, for the last semester, a class on wrongful convictions. There's a great database that's emerging from the University of Michigan. It's called the National Registry of Exonerations. They're tabulating data on every exoneration that they can find that's occurred since 1989. And some of their statistics are really interesting. They have found so far 1,085 people who've been exonerated, and my language here is wrong. It says people who committed violent crimes. It's people convicted, falsely convicted of committing violent crimes. These are all exonerees at this point. Well, out of those people, 24%, almost a quarter, were convicted of a violent crime against a person under the age of 18, a minor or a child. And out of those child victim exonerees, half of them have been exonerated for child sex abuse charges, which is an enormous number. I mean, it's just a very large number. And then 1/3 of those 129 were involved in cases similar to this, where there were suspicions of satanic abuse by multiple perpetrators, very strange scenarios. As a matter of fact, in this particular case, the allegations were that these women held up guns to the children's heads, that they injected their genitals with strange liquids, that these things went on day in and day out, and no one ever heard any screaming in this apartment building that had cardboard walls practically. There's always this idea that it's all extremely diabolically, cleverly done, and it doesn't leave any evidence except for the little tiny white line on the hymen. 1/3 of all the child sex abuse exonerations in this country that we're aware of now have involved these weird child sex abuse hysteria cases, which is what this project calls cases such as this. And then I go down and see that number 11 there. You see that 11 people have been exonerated for murdering babies by shaking them. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, what shaken baby syndrome is, as a piece of what we will talk about as junk science. So you see that there are a lot of women in the child crime exonerees, and you see that most of those women, if you look at that 35 figure, that's 14% of the child crime exonerees are women, and most of those were convicted of child sex abuse, which is very odd, given the fact that almost all child sex abusers who are guilty are men. So you can see that this panic over child sex abuse actually implicates or redounds on women. The panic affects women disproportionately. So let me tell you about the other case. This is the case of the woman who just walked out in Austin last week, and her husband will probably be coming out tomorrow. That's called the Keller case. Let me move over to another film so that you can see what they looked like in 1992 when they were convicted.
I can tell you this, there are graves that have been dug up at the cemetery. Ritual abuse.
You know, the repeated physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual assaults, combined with the systematized use of symbols through ceremonies designed and orchestrated to attain harmful effects.
The trial of Frances and Daniel Keller for the sexual abuse of a 3-year-old girl began at the Travis County Courthouse in Austin, Texas on November 16, 1992. 3 children had accused the couple not only of sexual abuse, but of bizarre ritualistic cruelty, often performed, they said, in the name of Satan.
Tell him it didn't happen. On my life, my children's life, it did not happen.
I'm Julia Dietz, and I owned the property that the Kellers were renting. They were very, very pleasant, very nice people, very loving people. They loved the children and treated them as though they were their own. I'd walk back in through there and back up to the house and stop by at odd times. I never saw anything that would suggest that there was any wrongdoing going on up there.
I don't know. I don't know what started. I really don't know what started it.
And as you can see from all of those clips, the early part of that little film that we just saw actually came from a TV show from 1993 when everybody still thought this stuff was happening. Well, actually, right after that, the government, the federal government, released a $750,000 piece of research that they funded, indicating that this stuff wasn't happening at all. It didn't exist. It was a panic, but it actually resulted in the conviction and imprisonment, sometimes for years, as you've seen, of over 100 people all over the country. What caused this panic? There are several different ways to look at it. One way is the cultural view. And the seniors among us will remember, I think, the 70s and the 80s when women finally started, white middle-class women finally started going out to work. And by the early 80s, most people with kids under 6 were leaving them in somebody's care when they went to work. And by 1984, more than 50% of all people who were leaving their kids in child care were using public child care. They weren't using their sister anymore or their mother-in-law. They were using public child care. And if you remember the women's magazines from then, you remember all the scare stories about how daycare was going to really hurt the children, it was going to create psychological problems, all kinds of abuse takes place in daycare and so on. Certainly the right wing of the culture didn't like the idea of women going out to work. I think for some of you younger people this will be hard to even imagine, but there was a huge culture war around the idea of women going to work. There was a culture war around the idea of kids going out and sort of being unsupervised by adults. And I'm not talking about daycare, but like teenage kids, mothers at work, not being able to surveil their kids every minute of the day. So there's a lot of fear. And there was also from feminism a real concern about real child abuse, a deep concern emerging in the 70s about domestic violence. Very hard time getting anybody to pay serious attention to real domestic violence inside the home, to incest inside the home. And a lot of feminists really kind of glommed on to this emerging belief about satanic ritual abuse because it had to do with innocent children. And it's very hard to get sympathy for feminist issues whose proponents are not thought of as innocent. For example, rape. If you remember old rape cases, it took years of battling in the courts to stop defense lawyers from asking women about their prior sex lives, right? I mean, women are not allowed to really complain about problems in their lives if they're considered bad women or sexually bad women. So children come to stand in in a lot of feminist activism during that time. Children came to stand in as symbols of complaints which nobody would argue with. And no one argued with these cases. No one argued with them for years. Across the board, politically and culturally, people believed that this was happening. And it was a panic that it's almost like McCarthyism. It was very much like the Salem witch trials, and it lasted about from the early 80s to the early 90s. Then another way to look at this panic and what fueled it is junk science, which is a recurring problem in all kinds of criminal justice issues. And I want to talk about that right now. We're going to look, first of all, at something that I consider junk science, and that is erroneous ideas about how children respond to questioning. There was a belief, and I remember being told this all the time as a journalist in the 80s, that A, children never lie about sex abuse, and B, they can't possibly talk about anything related to sex because they've never been exposed to it. And C, it's you just, if they're not talking about it, it's probably because they've been terrorized by the Satanists, and so you just have to keep on pressing them and to get them to talk about it. And you can even use dolls, which are reliable. This was the idea in the 80s. So you're going to look at an interview of one of the children in the Keller case, and you're going to see the kind of interviewing that was done back then with an analysis by a psychologist who has researched how this kind of interviewing affects kids. He's found that within just a few minutes with kids this age, about 4 years old, you can produce false allegations which will even morph into false memories in the child. So the child will be traumatized because the child will think for many, many years thereafter, if not for the rest of her life, that this really happened.
My name is Dr. James Wood. I'm a professor of psychology in the University of Texas at El Paso. I study child suggestibility, child interviewing in legal settings, and I've studied a lot on what are called satanic ritual abuse cases, bizarre cases from the 80s and 90s, where bunches of children made very strange and weird allegations against their teachers or their caretakers. There was it's usually called a hysteria, a mass panic that was set off. It was greatest from the mid-80s to about the mid-90s. And in its heyday, you had places in New Jersey, Florida, Los Angeles, where groups of preschool children would suddenly make these bizarre allegations that their teachers had sexually abused them and made them participate in these bizarre ceremonies that involved killing of animals, sacrifices of babies, things like that. There was a belief that there were these satanic cults all around the United States that had these designs against our children, and that they were trying to take over the country, and that they were trying to take over our daycare centers. And kind of under the influence of these people that believed in this, you had certain people in law enforcement, certain therapists that would question children suggestively about this, and they would extract these statements from children that these children had been forced to participate in these bizarre ceremonies. And looking back, we see that it was due to primarily to suggestive questioning and to this kind of urban legend that was going around. It was adults pressuring children. You can see it very clearly in the Keller case when you read about the testimony of the therapist that worked with Christy, the little girl. And that therapist was clearly a true believer in the satanic ritual abuse stuff. She went out and consulted on it, and then she came and in her questioning of the child starts making these bizarre allegations about the babies being fed to the sharks, about bodies coming out of graves, and that was classic ritual abuse stuff. And we know historically that when these sorts of allegations start to abuse, you have an adult who knows about this questioning a kid, and the kid starts saying it. You almost always find out what's going on is that the adult is probably inadvertently planting those ideas in the child's head. Now, the other place that you see it, though, besides the therapist, the adults doing it, is in the questioning of the children in the case. In particular, Christy is interviewed. That in that question, you can see a lot of suggestive influences coming to bear on that little girl. This interview is very seriously flawed. It's highly suggestive. I don't think you can place reliance on what the child says here. It's so much a product of what the adults are pressuring the child into saying. It's so much a mirror of what the adults are saying to the child, and at most she reflects back some of what they've said. Compared to other cases I've seen, the child's statement in this is very unconvincing, and it's largely because of the way the interview is conducted. This is pretty shocking to see. To know that there are still people in jail based on a case like this, that there was highly suggestive interviewing in the case. There was a therapist who was apparently believing in cults, satanic cult abuse, and was apparently questioning the child about that. And we have that the child was making these very bizarre allegations that are typical of these satanic ritual abuse cases about the sharks, right, and the bodies and so on. This is This is stuff that historically we know is just like a witch hunt. And it's shocking to find out that it was. It's shocking to find out that someone in Austin, Texas, was put into jail and remains in jail based on this sort of case. I'm very disturbed by this case. I feel it was a miscarriage of justice.
I've been locked up in prison 18 years for a crime I didn't commit. Get out? I hope and pray. I just want the truth to come out. I want to go home.
That's one of the investigative techniques that led to convictions. However, a lot of times these kids would get up and testify, and they would be all over the map. They would contradict what they'd said before, and they said, I can't remember, and the testimony often was pretty easy for a defense lawyer to discredit or to cast doubt about. But almost inevitably, a doctor would come in, a pediatrician, and talk about the white lines on the hymen, or talk about the bumps. And that also turns out to have been junk science. Let me just show you a little graphic that I have. I'm going to show you this graphic because when we talk about research into children's genitalia that's taken place since the late 80s and early 90s, and about how the lines and the bumps turned out to be on normal kids too. A lot of little girls where there's no suspicion of abuse have these little anomalies on their hymens and throughout the rest of their genitalia. It doesn't mean anything. But the question to me that's so interesting is, why did people jump to the idea that it did? And so now when the lawyers talk to the journalists, or when people talk to people like you, they're like, oh, the little line on the genitals, the little scar on the hymen, it really wasn't anything. And nobody it's very scary to even think about genitals, children's genitals. So I noticed nobody really understands this, and I thought maybe I should show this audience some children's genitals, because the Google image is filled with pediatric images of these anomalies, because there's been so much research done now showing that they're normal. But I don't even like to look at the insides of mouths. I mean, it makes me sick. But I did want you to look at normal, these are just sketches of what hymens look like. Because I know people my age, we have such mystified ideas about the hymen. I know when I was young, the idea was it was this thing that you had, and then when you first had sex, you weren't a virgin anymore, and the hymen it popped, or the cherry, and it popped, and there was this whole thing about the hymen and virginity. And in fact, what research shows into embryology is that you have a lot of little marks at the midline of the body going, especially in the genitalia. In that area, the embryo joins, in utero. Early in development of the fetus, the embryo, you have two halves and they finally join. And it's just like a mold, like one of those Virgin Mary molds, those plastic things that you get from Italy, and they have the little line through the middle because it was a mold that went together. So anytime you have an embryological joining, this is what I've learned, you have features that have no function. They're just like those little lines when you buy the cheap statue. And they have no function. The hymen has no function. It was not put there by nature or God or anybody to mark virginity. It's just a joining line. And anything that has no function can have tremendous variation. And you might also compare it to breasts. I mean, breasts have the function of lactation, but they also have this sort of aesthetic function apparently, but there's tremendous variation. So these are just some examples of normal hymens, some sketches. Now, the first one is the one that all the pediatricians imagined everybody had. It's perfectly round. It's called annular, which I think is interesting because that comes from the Latin word for ring, and it's like a wedding ring, It's perfectly round, and that's what everyone's hymen was supposed to look like. Well, the pediatrician started seeing another very common one, which is the second one, called crescentric, or the moon, right? And you can see that there's no edge at the top. And when they would see that with no edge, and they'd say, wow, the edge was worn away by child sexual abuse. Or they would see the septate, or they'd see the cribiform, and they'd say, wow, what happened there? It looks like a scar. There's a scar there. There's a lot of scars there. Or they'd see lines on the edge, which I'm not going to show you. I do not want to show you real photographs because they just look too much like the inside of a lip, So, but you can see with all this variation that no one knows anything about, and no one wants to know anything about this. You can have a lot of almost medieval assumptions about what a perfect genital is supposed to look like, and if it doesn't look perfect, somebody must have heard it. So that was the pseudoscience or the junk science of this period. And since then, finally, some doctors started looking at hundreds of non-abused children and saw that there was all kinds of variation. And now the Kellers are about ready to be released. Fran was released last week. Her husband will be released tomorrow. The San Antonio Four were released 10 days ago. And it was actually because of habeas corpus filings based on the junk science about the medical evidence. And there's a new law in Texas called the Junk Science Law that passed in September that says that you can get a new hearing now if your conviction was largely based on junk science. It's a great law, and my organization hopes to get that law going in other states as well. Okay, good ending, we hope, for these people, six fossils from the days of satanic ritual abuse. But there's an ongoing problem with panic over danger to children. Specifically, we could look at false accusations which continue. It does seem that when children are, when there are allegations of children being abused, or when children die, when children are killed in fires, for example, when babies, for one reason or another, die at homes and under the care of their mothers or their babysitters, their nannies, there tends to be a tremendous amount of people are just so anxious to figure out who did this. It's very hard to accept the idea of an accident when children die. It's just our tendency, we want to blame somebody. It's a type of emotional closure, I think. And there's still a tremendous amount of junk science that comes to bear in these cases. In arson, for example, a lot of ideas that fire examiners had when they went into burned out structures where children died, or where anybody died for that matter. They would say, oh, there's some streaks here, some long black streaks in the rubble, and that shows that kerosene was poured. And I had a lot of ideas like that. This was an intentional fire because of the streaks or because of the char pattern. So now there is empirical research. There are labs now where houses are set on fire, and and then people look at what's left, and they see that no, the streaks weren't from kerosene. That's just the way fire is when it gets to a certain temperature. There's all kinds of new, real science now. People have been executed. There was a man in Texas executed, Cameron Todd Willingham, based on junk science in fire forensics. Shaken baby syndrome for years now, ever since the 70s, this has been something in the medical books, that if you shake a baby, you will bang the head against the skull repeatedly and cause all kinds of swelling, and you will cause all kinds of neck trauma, and the baby will die or be severely injured. It turns out now that it doesn't appear that there's such a thing as shaken baby syndrome. It does not appear that shaking a baby will kill the baby. And I don't know all the details, but it's a growing body of science. And yet, as we saw in the exoneration statistics, a large number of women who've been exonerated were convicted for allegedly shaking their babies to death. So, and there are all kinds of, there's just all kinds of women who are incarcerated. There's a woman in Texas who's been in prison now because she was babysitting a child who died and had paper towels in its throat. And a bunch of experts came and testified that there was no way that a child could put paper towels down its throat. And so now there's experts coming forward and saying, yes, of course a child could put paper towels down its throat. Again, these arguments about science that can only be resolved when you do scientific research. But beyond the false allegations that lead to convictions and people in prison, in the larger culture, the one that we live in, because I don't think too many of us know a falsely accused person convicted of hurting a child who's in prison, we all live now in this state of panic over endangerment to children. People will not now let their kids walk to school. They won't let their kids take the subway by themselves. People in the suburbs won't let their kids play in the front yard. This is a common thing in the United States. And there's a terror of pedophiles, for example. There's a terror that, you've got to go look on the sex offender registry to find out who's living near you. When we know that sex offender registries, there's a lot of social science research now indicating that sex offender registries, while they make life completely impossible for sex offenders who've served their time and for those people's families and children, they stigmatize them, they turn them into subhumans, and we know that sex offender registries do not protect children. They just don't affect the rate of sex crimes against children at all. There are just all kinds of ways that this panic changes our lives in negative ways, creates fear, creates distrust of people, creates paranoia about the safety of our children, and really doesn't do anything constructive to keep children safe. And the other thing I would suggest, if anybody wants to read a good book, there's a book called Sex, Panic, and the Punitive State by an anthropologist named Roger Lancaster. Sex, Panic, and the Punitive State. You could read that along with your YouTube viewing of Indictment. And what he argues is that sex panic actually pulls in a population that normally has not been part of the criminal justice system, and that's mostly white guys. I mean, white men are the main population that we think of when we think of sex offenders. And the society's willingness to deny due process to these people, for example, civil commitment, sex offender registries, the kind of railroading that we saw in these cases, his contention is that we live in a culture now where there's a tremendous amount of concern for the rights of sexual and racial minorities and their rights. There's an understanding that the criminal justice system redounds on, for example, young black men. We know all that. That's something that's out there. But this is a part of the criminal justice system that nobody wants to touch. I mean, even the ACLU, it's like, stay away. We don't want to deal with this. The most militant due process defenders don't want to defend people accused of child sex abuse. And when you have that kind of a situation, when you have that kind of Achilles heel in the criminal justice system, that opens the door for the state to trample on due process rights for everyone. It's a very dangerous little door or Achilles heel. And so I would like to close by just saying that even though we've had some happy endings in Texas lately, the problem of panic over endangerment to children continues and really needs some work. And if anybody wants to ask questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, Texas, I'm from Texas, and I don't like to beat up on Texas unless, I love to beat up on Texas, but only when it deserves it. Yes, I mean, New York had some of these cases and still has some of these problems. Massachusetts had many of these cases. I would say primarily now, the problem now, because we're not dealing with satanic ritual abuse craziness anywhere now, but the problem now, I think, is in child protection services, bad training. You actually still have people who have not been trained, and I know this, in small towns in Texas where they have no funding and the people don't go to training, they will still interview kids this way. So I think that much of the problem now with false accusations has to do with bad training on the part of child protection services and bad funding. I mean, if you have a worker who's got way too many cases and can't really give the attention that you need to pay to develop some skepticism on a case-by-case basis, you have to look at every case carefully on its own merits, then you have a risk. And that's true not just in Texas. Well, they're not out of the woods, actually. They are out on this new law, and they and the Kellers, the other people that you saw, are the first people who've been affected by this law. And they're out on a writ of habeas corpus, and the idea is that the DAs in both counties have agreed that there are issues in their cases that merit them being released on bail, released on signature bond. But their cases have to go to the Court of Criminal Appeals, to the appellate court in Texas, and the lawyers are worried because the Court of Criminal Appeals could send them back to prison. And it's hard to say. I mean, that's one thing that I'll beat up on Texas about. It's a very conservative court, and they make decisions and they say things like, well, we know that this evidence probably was instrumental in convicting the defendant, but at the same time, and they'll cite some technicality and just send the defendant back. So they're still in the woods, both of these cases. And that should probably happen in the spring. There should be a hearing. If the Court of Criminal Appeals remands for new trials, the DA in San Antonio has said that she will not retry the cases, and at that point they will try for exoneration, the 4 women. And in Texas, if you're exonerated, you get $80,000 a year for every year that you were in prison.